This is Scott DeCosenza for LibertyNation.com, joined today by Mark Angelides, our managing editor. Hi, Mark. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Scott. Thanks for having me.
And we have some very interesting developments out of California and their penal code and incarceration in the Golden State, and that's what you're here to talk about today. So what is the latest and what's happening with incarceration in California, Mark?
Okay, well, depending on how you look at it, it's either a sweeping new reform or tinkering around the edges. But Governor Gavin Newsom, he's signed in a bill that passed pretty much without difficulty at all. And this is that no new contracts to be signed with private or for-profit prisons as of the coming year, 2020, and that as of 2028, these places will no longer exist. Now, presumably that's when the last of the existing contracts runs out. So the governor, he said that it's because the private prisons, it contributes to almost an ambience of over-incarceration in the state that does not reflect Californian values. Quite what those values are remains to be seen, but that's where we stand with the new law. So from next year, no new contracts for profit or private prisons.
The business wants, any business wants customers and sales, right? That's sort of job one, right? We want clicks and likes and subscribes, and people who are watching this now could do us a solid by liking and subscribing and commenting, and that's what we're selling in a manner of speaking. And they're selling their services, and they want more inmates because it makes more sense, right? So those prison companies, certainly it does behoove them for legislators to increase criminal penalties for anything and everything, right?
Sure, but here's the thing: you've got to be wondering whether this is actually doing any good whatsoever, because if you drill down into the numbers on this, it really seems that this is far more of a grand plan virtue signal than actually attempting to do anything about over-incarceration, which I think both of us probably agree that over-incarceration is a major problem. But if you look at the numbers, it's estimated that California has between 115,000 and 125,000 actual prisoners. Now, of this number of prisoners, only between 1,400 and 1,700 are kept in for-profit or private prisons. So what you've really got is a state that has, let's say, 120,000 prisoners, and they're deciding to do something only, not about actually stopping the people going to prison as such, but about removing a financial incentive for a tiny percentage of prisoners here. And the prisoners really
I'm glad that you revealed those numbers, Mark, because that does paint a clearer picture for us, and it does seem like this is more of a virtue signal than anything else. And I do know that the California Prison Guard Union is one of the more powerful unions in the country, and they, for instance, are at the vanguard of opposing anything that may reduce the inventory of people in California prisons, including perhaps most famously, the marijuana liberalization laws that have come to pass in California over the recent decade.
Yeah, the end results of these of what's happening here, it's very much a one-step thinking proposition from the governor. But the end result of what's going to happen here, it could be a number of maybe three different things. One is that the judiciary is encouraged to not give custodial sentences because obviously they don't have anywhere else to put the prisoners if they're getting rid of these extra 1,400 to 1,700 places. So they're going to be encouraged to not give custodial sentences. Number two, they're going to give shorter sentences. Or number three, it's going to come down to a case of literally shipping the prisoners out of state, which is certainly not fair on the families of those who have committed crimes.
Yeah, that does put a severe burden, especially on the ones who are of limited means and can't travel to Kansas to go visit a loved one who's incarcerated, for instance.
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate situation that that the governor feels that he's doing something about incarceration by doing this. I mean, it's great that people are looking at prison reform. I think prison reform is really going to be the next big thing in the US. I really think and hope that
prisons around the world are in a shocking state relative to the societies they live in, I think, and ours is no exception in the United States.
Yeah, I see the state of England. But what's really happening with this is nothing. This is tinkering around the edges. It's doing it to, as you say, quite likely appease the unions. It's there to appease those who are anti-profit, regardless of if the for-profit prisons do a better job than the regular prisons. I don't know if they do or not, but there are some people who just oppose the idea of making a profit on things.
Profits are violence, Mark. That's what
apparently, yeah,
that's what we learned from the progressives. Okay, Mark, there were, I think, over a dozen new laws passed on the criminal justice issue in California alone last week with the governor's signature. And one of them is a prohibition on government officials, both state and local, for using facial recognition software until, I think there's a 3-year sunset on that. So until some of the issues are sorted out about it with respect to privacy. But there was another one that I thought was really likely to be very impactful, and that is that California had previously had a mandatory sentence for anyone who was going to be on probation for possessing heroin or cocaine of any sort, that they spend 180 days in jail. So that means the person who has never had a previous conviction, for instance, and the police discovered drugs on them, even if they were eligible for probation, they would still have to do that 180 days. So that's 6 months in jail. That is a huge burden for any person, whether you're a CEO or a homeless person, to have to give up that much of your life to be on probation for possession of a drug. So anyway, I think that elimination of that mandatory minimum essentially is a positive development as well for the taxpayers and citizens of California.
That might be how they're hoping to keep the prison numbers down. It's certainly an angle on it.
Okay, yeah, that is certainly one of the real-world implications of that new law. Any other implications or predictions going forward that we should look out for in the wake of these new laws in California?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the odds are that now that this, along with the other raft of legislation, that will, certainly getting rid of the mandatory 180 days, that's going to free up a bit of prison space. But what you're going to see, I think, is that this starts to get emulated around the country, especially in coastal states where they're looking to cut down on bills because it costs a lot to incarcerate somebody. Now, whether that's going to make the streets any safer to have convicted criminals out on the streets earlier or not receiving custodial sentences, I think we're going to see quite a spike in crime, to be fair, in these coastal cities. When we look back in, say, 5 years and we see that there's been a somewhat of an uptick, I think this has some long-ranging effects.
Well, there's a counterintuitive that could be at play there, Mark, which is that if the police, for instance, are detailed not to arrest, for instance, I mean, if you think of all the marijuana arrests that California police officers conducted a decade ago, the many dozens of thousands a year that they can now reduce that number to zero, or the few that involve inappropriate transactions with minors, perhaps, or something like that. But all those law enforcement resources can now be directed elsewhere to what those of us who I would argue should be directed to common law crimes.
Absolutely.
Rape, murder, robbery, arson, those sorts of things that people want the police to turn their attention to, for whom there is no it's not a victimless, quote unquote, crime, right? There is a victim. So could there any chance that there could be a peace dividend that actually yields a positive benefit to society rather than the negative one you've predicted?
It's interesting that you should mention that, because this week, these last 2 weeks in the UK, we've had a group called Extinction Rebellion. I'm not sure if they've made the media over there, but they're an activist group of protesters who have essentially shut down London, calling for climate justice from the government, and have
Which color vest do they does it a green vest movement, or
no,
is
it's very much tie-dye.
tie-dye? Okay, very good.
But yeah, so they're in the streets. They're doing. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing. I think the best way to describe it is a badly enacted performance art across the streets of London, shutting down pretty much the entire city, stopping ambulances getting through to where they need to go, causing major disruption, obviously. But what's happened is that 1,000 protesters have been arrested so far. Okay, now this is in London. Earlier this year, the amount of murders in London beat that of New York, which for London, it's quite, for the UK, that's really quite a record. And so what you have is imagine how much effort it takes to arrest 1,000 protesters. And people were getting stabbed every hour, not in these protests, but across the rest of London.
Right.
Because the police were drawn away, busy dealing with performance art.
Quite clearly you've outlaid the one thing that your country needs most of all is knife law reform. No, I mean, quite clearly that's what's out of control.
I shall send you the documents on the new knife laws that are coming through, Scott. Perhaps we can talk about them in our next LNTV.
Well, God save the Queen. Thank you so much for joining us. Mark Angelides, managing editor for LibertyNation.com. I said it once, I'll say it again. Please go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe, and visit Liberty Nation for all your conservatarian news and analysis. This is Scott DeCosenza. Thanks for watching.